So here's the one sentence, which is reported from Climate Home News because they were there. 4 p.m. on the 15th, they disagreed on everything, including how to carry the process forward. So in other words, what is it now? 25 years? 25 years of denial and delay. It's not funny anymore. I mean, you could call it Monty Pythonist, but oh my God, no.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. We're glad to have you back. In this session, we'll be discussing Bonn, the UN Intersessional Climate Conference. This is also referred to, I recently found out, as SB 56. And I believe this stands for subsidiary body. And by now, countries, most of the world is familiar with COP, Conference of Parties. But Bonn is something that is not as well known, not as well spoken about, although perhaps no less important. And I know that, Peter, you have been to at least one Bonn conference in the past. I'd like it if you could help, just give us a sense of what is Bonn? Is it always held in Bonn? If so, why? And what is the subsidiary body 56?
A brief interruption for context before continuing. SB 56 took place in Bonn, Germany from the 6th to 16th of June 2022. Both Peter and Paul had NGO observer badges and chose to attend virtually. From wikipedia.org, the article on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, link in the description. A subsidiary body is a committee that assists the conference of the parties, consisting of permanent and temporary or ad hoc committees. The permanent committees are the SBSTA, which stands for Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice, and the SBI, Subsidiary Body for Implementation. Temporary ad hoc, and an example would be the Ad Hoc Working Group on the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, ADP. This committee concluded its work in Paris in 2015. So, subsidiary bodies meet twice a year, once usually at the COP conference. So for example, SB 52, 53, 54, and 55, these meetings took place at the Glasgow conference last November 2021. A separate conference usually takes place in Bonn. So SB 56 was the 56th session of the subsidiary bodies. Both permanent bodies convened at this conference.
So yeah, Bonn has a fancy purpose-built conference center where these conferences and meetings that are supposed to decide how to provide us with a livable future happen regularly. Yeah. So I've been receiving daily updates from them. And so how can I describe what's happening at the Bonn Intersessional? Well, I can tell you in one sentence. And I got to say first, when I reviewed everything that I got, and then when I reviewed a couple of papers that NOAA had published, I got feeling friggin' furious. But anyway, I've calmed down since. So here's the one sentence, which is reported from Climate Home News because they were there. 4 p.m. on the 15th, they disagreed on everything, including how to carry the process forward. So in other words, what is it now? 25 years? 25 years of denial and delay, right? It's not funny anymore. I mean, you could call it Monty Pythonist, but oh my God, no. So NOAA just released a couple of papers, and it confirms that what I've been reporting for the past few years, that everything is getting worse faster. Every single one of the three main greenhouse gases are currently increasing faster than they ever have. So at Bonn, the denial is pervasive and universal. And it's insane because they're all talking occasionally about closing the gap on 1.5 degrees C. We're going to be hit by 1.5 degrees C 2030. All the science says that, but they're still denying it. Anyway, so we will be at 1.5 degrees C at 2030. We're not even going to be ready because we will remain in total denial. We won't do a goddamn thing. And that leaves us with a disastrous world. We will be at 2 degrees C by 2050, and we'll be there because of the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere reported by NOAA, which are accelerating faster than ever. We'll be at 2 degrees C by 2050. The IPCC 6th assessment said that we're tracking currently on what they call our implemented policies, a course of 3.2 degrees C by 2100. So that's 2 degrees C before 2050. So what are the countries doing? What are the leaders doing? What are the negotiators doing? What have they been doing for 25 years that they're still determined to do? What they're doing is they're leaving the world market economy in control. That's what they're doing, right? They have been wasting 25 years. They're still wasting all this time at Bonn, talking about the same things that they've talked about for the past 20 years. I just can't believe how they managed to keep doing it. Well, they're in denial, but this definitely denies the world what the IPCC 6th assessment called a livable future. When the IPCC says that we have to secure a livable future, it's time to really, really think hard. And in my view, to get pretty mad. Hell on Earth is at most 20 years away. Irreversibly. No going back to this wonderful, wonderful life, this wonderful planet. Unbelievable. So I just think we've got to get mad about this, people. I really, really, really do.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Peter. And I think you might have been a bit sanguine there. You know, I know that we throw around numbers and predictions. I think hitting 1.5 in 2030, I think we're gonna best that from people that I hear. I do think that we'll definitely hit it before 2030. And Paul, I want to know, I'm not sure about your history and if you've attended Bonn. I know that you're badged for this Bonn as well as Peter. And what are your thoughts? Are you a bit more hopeful? Do you feel the same way? Catch us up a bit.
Well, I feel much the same way as Peter. You know, he mentioned the 1.5 degrees by 2030, and one of the NOAA reports recently said there was a 50% chance of reaching the 1.5 within the next 5 years. That would be by 2027. And I think that's based just on when we can have a powerful El Nino year. Right now, we're in a very powerful La Nina, the opposite, where less heat is coming out of the oceans, you know, and we're going into maybe a third winter of that state, which is, so that's unusually long for La Nina. Most climate models show that there'll be fewer of the La Ninas, or at least less severe, but the opposite's sort of been happening in the last 20 years. So that needs to be understood more. But next time we have the El Nino, the warmer year, lots of heat coming from the oceans, we're going to very likely pass 1.5. Like you, I think, well, in terms of the 2050, 2 degrees, the warming is accelerating clearly. Peter's mentioned that the greenhouse gases, the 3 main ones, have been shooting up. Things are still accelerating to the dark side, if you like. So if that continues, and it will, unless we take strong action, serious strong action, emergency action on the climate crisis, then I think that's a very conservative estimate, 2050, for passing 2 degrees. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that are going on at Bonn. I mean, Bonn has a lot of things in common with the COPs. The biggest thing is that they're all failing. But we have to keep trying. Now, many of these conferences look at mitigation. What can we do to reduce greenhouse gases? That's obviously failing. They're looking more and more at adaptation. How can we help society become more resilient and adapt to what is coming in the pipeline? But of course, adaptation has limits. For example, we live on the coast, sea level rises, building seawalls is just like a Band-Aid. How high do you build them, for example, because they're just a temporary Band-Aid with rapid sea level rise. We're entering really an era of loss and damage. So loss and damage is being considered more and more often at these climate conferences. Although in Glasgow, they had something called the Glasgow Dialogue, where they talked about the importance of talking about including the dialogue on loss and damage certainly in the next COP, in COP27. But loss and damage is a human rights issue, of course, because so far, I think over a decade ago, developed countries promised to give about $100 billion per year into loss and damage funds, which would go to developing countries. Because climate change is here, we're facing the consequences all over the planet. Large parts of the planet where countries did the least to contribute to the climate change that has occurred are suffering huge losses. So the idea is for a climate equity or a climate justice thing, a human rights thing, to give these countries money. I mean, it's not charity, it's not humanitarian aid, it's climate justice, really. So Glasgow didn't really talk too much about loss and damage, but it was slipped in at the end as a dialogue. And at Bonn, there's been a lot of push by developing countries, and some developed countries have joined, like Canada's environment minister is pushing for this as well. But meanwhile, Canada is still subsidizing and pumping huge amounts of money into the fossil fuel industry. But we are talking about loss and damage. I mean, small islands are getting quite desperate, and up to now, rich nations have been unwilling to provide the fund. I think as of 2019, the total money going to loss and damage was, I think, about $80 billion, and that was accumulative. We're supposed to be putting in $100 billion per year. So they're trying to, in UN jargon, a dialogue just means you talk about it. If it's on the agenda, it means that decisions should be made by countries to take action on the particular thing that's being discussed. I mean, the rich versus poor divide is an age-old problem, right? It's an age-old issue. Rich countries, the US, Europe, other rich countries are really they're not even meeting their commitments at all. And these commitments were made long ago for this loss and damage. But public opinion, both in the rich countries and in the developing countries, is building a very strong case about that it's just immoral and unjust. There's a lot of posturing. So hopefully there's pressure within countries to pony up that 100 billion per year, the loss and damage promised by rich nations to developing nations. And that promise was made over a decade ago. So the climate conferences are changing the tone a bit, because they've up to now or recently, they've mostly been on mitigation, like climate financing, for example, money for mitigation, money for adaptation, but ignoring loss and damage, really. And that's starting to change as more countries get more and more damages. If you look at climate disasters, and mostly from extreme weather events, the funding needed to recover from climate disasters has increased over 800% in 2 decades. So this was really discussed quite a bit at Bonn, but we're nearing the end of the conference, and they have not agreed to take action on it. And they're hardly agreeing to even talk about it at the next COP, but I think that will be decided, that they at least have it as part of a dialogue of the next COP, at least passing it along, because it was in the Glasgow conference. Another important thing that they're talking about is they talk about the global stock taking. This was basically the metrics, or countries have their nationally determined contributions. They say they're going to do certain things. So the global stock taking is actually to see what countries have actually done so far. Are they anywhere near meeting their goals? And the global stock take is supposed to wrap up and be completed by the COP28 in 2023. And then that will really expose countries that are slipping just to meet the Paris climate goals, which we know are not sufficient to keep us nowhere near under 1.5, which is probably impossible, but not even under 2 degrees. That was another thing. They talked about the divide at Bonn. There's recognition that 10% of the richest people in the world are creating 40% of the emissions. So it's not just developed countries versus developing. It's a small fraction of people in the developed countries. Fewer people create more emissions. There was some talk on water by different water groups at Bonn. Water is often invisible in the climate conversation. A group called Alliance for Water made some headway in raising the issues of water. And of course, water, we know the hydrology of the atmosphere of Earth's system is changing. With heating, there's water vapor in there. We know the hydrology has changed. And so water is now, there's not enough water going to many places. That's clearly the case in large parts of the US even. People are very aware of it. And there's too much water going in other places. Look daily at climate news, and there's a flood, or there's torrential rains leading to flooding somewhere in the world. It's happening. So the distribution of water on the planet is definitely changing. And another thing is the plant-based treaty. Many, more and more people are warning governments that a mass move to a vegan diet without meat or animal products is imperative for the survival of humanity. And there was a famous quote from a famous IPCC author saying, ethically, all unnecessary methane sources have to be cut as fast and as far as possible. This means global veganism is now a survival imperative. And that quote, which I read from a Wellington, New Zealand newspaper, is by our own Dr. Peter Carter here. So there's been a number of different UNFCCC reports coming out at this conference. So one report is on why climate change impacts women differently, or in brackets, more keenly, more seriously, why it impacts women more seriously than men. So the UNFCCC has a new report out on that. You can also see that in books like Drawdown, educating women is imperative, and it does talk about how money to women for small businesses, that are sustainable, things like that can make a huge impact on the amount of emissions and greenhouse gases. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue, another NGO, they had a report on climate misinformation and disinformation at COP26 at the Glasgow COP. and beyond. And they talk about the repercussions of denial and delayism. I mean, denial is one thing, and we're getting less denial as things become more obvious, but we're getting a lot of delayism, if you like. I mean, which is almost as bad. You just keep delaying and delaying and delaying. So there's a lot of trust being lost. Peter's emphasized that we've had many, many COPs, and there's lots of commitments from countries and promises, but they're not honored. So if they're not honored, they create division. Each COP that we have with more and more promises, the trust gets further and further away. Follow the money. There needs to be financial penalties on countries that don't meet their commitments at these conferences. Otherwise, what's the point of these conferences? What's the point of commitments if they're not honored? You know, I think back to developed countries saying they would get rid of subsidies on fossil fuels. You know, that was quite a while ago, and yet fossil fuel subsidies have increased ever more even after, you know, we leave the pandemic. Remember the nugget of information that at COP26 in Glasgow, which many of us attended, there were more lobbyists there for big polluters than there was for any national delegation. If it was a country, the fossil fuel lobbyists, they were far better represented in much larger numbers than any country in Glasgow. So we need to stop that. You know, that's clearly a detriment to achieving any progress at these conferences. We need to keep these lobbyists out of climate legislation. So there was progress on oceans, I would say, at Bonn. They started the first annual ocean and climate dialogue at Bonn. So talking about oceans, and this is going to be continued hopefully at future COPs. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but the COPs I've been to, you know, have very little about the ocean. COP27 coming up, it really needs to be an implementation COP. It can't just be a discussions. I mean, we have to draw the line, as Peter said, get very, very upset at the inaction, and we need to get serious because, you know, there's not going to be a stable world for all the young people, for our kids, grandkids, you know, and then it gets to these intergenerational equity. We're not putting any value on future life, future human life, or future animal life on this planet. Our economic systems give those no value, and as a result, we're in the real bind that we're in right now.
Okay, so Peter, Paul brought up the article that you wrote on the imperative of adopting a vegan diet. Do you really think that if everyone were to take on a vegan diet, let's say tomorrow, would we notice a change from that?
Well, yeah, because we would actually that would actually result in a reduction of all three greenhouse gases. But mainly, I think, as Paul has already mentioned, it would be a very major cut on methane. And the scientists are saying more and more and more. They didn't used to talk about methane very much at all, but they're saying more and more that we've got to slash methane as well as CO2, because that's going to have a faster result on the temperature. The heat's going to the oceans. I'm a medical doctor. I get my patients to switch to vegetarianism, you know, but they didn't do it until they had the stroke or the heart attack that I want them to do. So it's a mystery, right? I mean, why don't we all switch to the healthiest diet that we can, which is the healthiest for the planet? We've known this for decades and decades and decades, confirmed by the IPCC, by the way. In their land report in 2019, they did a great chart on the greenhouse emissions of all the various diets. They had about 15 of the diets, right? Well, veganism was way on the top, and it was way superior to vegetarianism, a lot more than I realized. I just want to say a quick thing. In 1992, in this climate change convention, in which all of the countries agreed to ensure climate safety, they said this: determined to protect the climate for future generations. So we talked a lot about dialogue. The dialogue has to change, right? We need to talk about how much we love our children. We need to talk about how much we love this planet. Everybody does, actually. That's a strange thing. Everybody does. And then we have to think about how we apply that, right? We feel the love, but then how are we going to apply it, make it happen? And that, of course, gets us to rights, as Paul mentioned, human rights. And he also mentioned life, rights for life. This is what we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about our relationship with everybody else on the planet. We need to, I mean, it must be very obvious, we need to have a human unity. We need to make a deep peace between ourselves, right? But we also need to do what Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said. We have to stop this war on nature, right? We have to prove how much we love nature and make it happen in our world. And we have to think about all the suffering that's going on today. Think about it, feel it, and think about what this world is going to be like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. It may be uncomfortable, but at least we would then be displaying our humanity, right? But we have to decide what kind of legacy we want to leave. And our team here have decided many years ago, right? And a lot of people have decided, but a lot more people have to think about their legacy.
When I think about the legacy of humanity, as I often do, I try not to be pessimistic, but it doesn't feel very good. And I appreciate what you had to say, Peter. Not everything is quantifiable, and it's quantifying things isn't always the most important way to do things. And I think there's something very much to be said about people feeling the reality of things as they are, as we have made them, and people seeing the absurdity of how contentious we've all become towards each other and the error in that way of living. I know that humanity is capable of living with a higher intention, with a sight set on something other than the self. But sometimes it's very easy to not think that my species will rise to the occasion. So I appreciate what you had to share, Peter, because I think it's very, very important, and definitely the most important thing, to be in touch with our humanity. We certainly lost that, I would have to say.
Paul has mentioned already, between the so-called wealthy nations and the so-called less wealthy nations, it's just getting worse. And so it's just being used as another obstruction, another reason for delay. So, I mean, yeah, Paul really hit it with years ago, our country's promised, not a lot of money. I mean, look at how much money we're putting into arms and wars and things. Not a lot of money. And every year they have these discussions and working groups. By the way, they couldn't even agree on how to describe their working groups at this Bonn Intersessional. Couldn't even agree to that. And then they couldn't even agree on how to talk about emissions. Some countries, even the United States, as a high emitter, brought up, well, we should talk about the high emitters. And of course, China was, it's a conflict. Somebody rather nicely described it as an ongoing ping pong game, right? NGO. But it's a constant conflict. So we're bringing the worst of intentions, the worst of humanity, into the most important issue that humanity has ever faced and ever had to deal with. So nothing happened. This is the point. Honestly, nothing happened. Hours and hours and hours, day after day after day.
I learned a bit more about the sort of the process and why they have these meetings. And the acid test is CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and we keep setting records in that. So that just tells me that any negotiations are just not succeeding for mitigation. Adaptation, has limits. I mean, how do you adapt to, we just had a massive derecho across Canada, across Ontario and Quebec, causing tremendous damages. These sort of extreme weather events are being faced by countries around the world. And it just seems when I go to these conferences or attend sessions that the sense of urgency is just not there among other. You talk to individuals and there's a lot of sense of urgency if they're with NGOs and they understand the issue, but doesn't seem to be there with government people. I don't know, people get jobs in government and I think their brain changes, their thinking pattern changes, and then the idea of keeping your job and of keeping your boss happy and stuff, that starts to dominate your thinking. You have a mortgage to pay, inflation rates going up. Your everyday sort of issues tends to change your priorities. There's a lot of distractions in today's society. When the food supply fails or when the water supply fails, then those things will be foremost on people's minds and there'll be a lot of panic ensuing, and people will say, whoa, nobody told me this was going to happen, sort of thing, which is absolute nonsense, right? Nobody's telling. I mean, this is what we're doing every video session. We're talking about risks that our society is facing. You're heading somewhere very rapidly. Eventually you reach that point. Why should it be a surprise to anybody? And we're heading very rapidly, for example, to a global food shortage and probably famine. We're heading very rapidly to an Arctic without any sea ice. So I don't see a sense of urgency at these conferences. It won't stop me attending, try to do our bit to let people know, what's happening, how quickly it's happening. But I just don't see the sense of urgency with meetings that I attend.
So I can give you a quick sense of how bad it's been in Bonn. So they're talking about the stock take, as Paul mentioned, right? Actually, the UN Climate Office did a stock take before Glasgow, and they did a stock take before the previous one. So we've had the stock takes, they've just not been published, right? So talking about a stock take in 2023, it's just a delay. So it's a delay of even taking a look with some kind of seriousness as, what they're supposed to be ratcheting up, by comparing each other's emissions. They negotiated what they call a work program, right? Now get this, the China, India, the Arab countries, they're big sort of powerful groups in the negotiations. They said, okay, yeah, we should do that work program and we'll get it finished by 2023, right? But then the EU and the United States said, oh no, the discussions should continue until 2030 to make the discussions meaningful. The issue is an issue of survival. This is how bad Bonn is. We were wondering about a title. We should have called it Bad Bonn, right? You gotta laugh or cry, right? I mean, this is so absurd. Yeah. It's an absolute crime.
There's obviously an enormous mismatch between our human politics to address the problem and how quickly the climate is changing. And, it doesn't care about, the climate doesn't care about us. It doesn't care about the planet. It behaves on physical properties, and we've changed the physical properties. So it's getting much more extreme, and, it's putting tremendous stress on our societies. So more and more stress. So there's more and more emphasis at these COPs on loss and damage. If you look back to the original COPs, it was all about mitigating, stopping climate change. There was almost nothing on adaptation. People thought if we talk about adaptation, it's like surrendering, it's like, accepting that huge changes are going to occur. We have to adapt. And then, as mitigation failed, adaptation came into being a big deal. In fact, there's a whole separate IPCC report on adaptation. And, and now we've reached the point where we're seeing huge consequences, and we're talking more and more about loss and damage. So there you have it, I guess, in a nutshell. So the Bonn, I would say the Bonn is mostly, or a great part of the Bonn Climate Conference it's a loss and damage conference. And it's trying to emphasize that we need to have the next COP being an implementation conference. We need hard and fast rules with penalties for countries that don't meet their commitments. But will that happen? I don't know. Depends on, a lot of it depends, I think, on lobbyists there. With so many lobbyists, they really weaken any actions of these conferences. So that we have to deal with them in some way, lobbyists. I mean, if you just see, okay, they're connected to a fossil fuel company. Okay, we don't want you at the climate conference. I don't know.
They're talking about loss and damage in terms of money. That's what they're doing. They're negotiating money. It's an economic negotiation that's going on. India took a strong stand, okay? But it wasn't to reduce how much coal India is burning, right? We're burning more coal than ever, by the way. It was a strong stand on getting as much money for adaptation. Now, India has a huge armaments industry. Huge. Talk about a mismatch, Paul mentioned mismatch. Oh my God. So the loss and damage we need to be discussing is what we've been discussing here in our group, right? How much do you want to lose? We've lost the coral reefs. We've probably lost the Amazon. How much do you want to lose? How much damage do you want to take?
Well, so there you have it, everyone. Bonn 2022. Bad, bad Bonn. Thank you for joining us. Don't despair. We're going to have some more nuggets of hope for you in the next Climate Emergency Forum. And we hope that you will join us because, as Peter said, we must embrace our humanity, okay? And in order to do that, we need to have some kind of hope. And I hope that you will join us with the next Climate Emergency Forum. I also hope that if you haven't subscribed, you will like this video and share it. And we look forward to seeing you again at the next Climate Emergency Forum.